清华大学亚洲政治中心主任。那之前的话，他是在就是我们台北办事处的处长，从2019年到2012年，所以他对台湾呢也是非常熟悉。那也曾经在北京呢担过处长，所以他在中国大陆跟台湾的关系他都非常熟悉。那他毕业于北卡纳大学硕士跟博士，所以今天非常荣幸因为他在就是台湾跟中国关系里面呢是非常的专业而且呢也在台湾待过非常多的时间，也在大陆待过非常多的时间，这样他对这个看法呢基本上呢值得我们去参考。热烈欢迎司徒主任。
大家好，小安好。可是今天我说英文，因为这是多半我的文水在这里都是英文的文水，因为我的博士是英文的文水。Anyway, I wanted to tell you that one of the reasons I decided to talk about why I read literature was because when I was young, when I went to high school, I went to an all-boys high school in New Jersey, and I come from a working-class family, and my father never graduated from high school, and my mother and my father's aspiration, their hope for me, was the middle-class dream at the time that I would become a doctor, because that was the middle-class dream. If I was a doctor, I would be a success. At the end of my first year in high school, if you did well, they would invite you to join one of two honors programs. One was science honors, and one was classics honors, where you would study ancient Greek, and everybody studied Latin. And my parents put a lot of pressure on me to study science because they wanted me to be a doctor. So I went into the science honors program. But early on I knew that what I really loved was writing. I wanted to write stories. I loved reading literature. And they kept on saying that I wouldn't get a job. And I tell you this story because I know many of you today face that same kind of a situation. I know that in America, for example, the number of people who study the humanities, the number of people who study literature is very small now. Almost nobody has a major in English literature. Instead, people try to find practical occupations. So that's what they study. So anyway, I worked at science, but I was never as good as some of the other students in the class. If there was an equation on the board, I wouldn't get it immediately. I'd have to go home and study the mathematical equation and think about it, and eventually I would get it. But writing always came very easily to me. And then, because I got a full scholarship to college, I figured I could study whatever I wanted. My parents weren't paying, so I studied English. And then when I had finished and graduated, I got a full fellowship from the US government to go to graduate school. And so I continued with English. At that time, partly because there was for a year or two a student deferment. I didn't want to go and fight in the Vietnam War. In fact, I opposed it. But then the lottery came up and I didn't have to go. Anyway, I continued with English literature. And at a certain point, when I was finishing my PhD, though, I decided I didn't want to just continue only reading books. I wanted to see life. So I took the Foreign Service exam. I passed it to my surprise, because I'd never had courses in political science or economics, but I'd read a lot of books. Anyway, I passed it, and I was invited to Washington, and I passed the oral exam, and I served as a diplomat for 34 years. I tell you all of this by way of background because I realize that when I talk to students today, to talk about literature could be a mission behind enemy lines. It's even more true at Tsinghua University, where I am now, because everybody there wants to be a computer scientist or an engineer. And I know many of you are physics major, many of you are seeking that kind of career. But I wanted to say, therefore, I'm not saying why study literature, but at least why you should be reading literature. And so I'm going to come up with some arguments why. One reason is I could tell you it's so you can make a lot of money. This is a picture of J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter books, which were made into movies. And she's now the 10th wealthiest woman in the United Kingdom. Very rich lady. So I can say, well, you become rich, but that's not necessarily the case. But that would be one argument. If you're a very successful writer, you can make money. Another argument I can tell you is so you can become famous forever. Everybody knows who the guy on the left is? Who's that? Any students? It's a kosher. Lucian, famous contemporary, considered, I guess, the father of modern Chinese literature, wanted to change China. And who's the guy on the right? That should be easier. William Shakespeare, right? So, indeed, if you become a famous writer, you're famous. Another reason, though, I can tell you to study literature is you can express your love to your girlfriend or your boyfriend. You can say, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when an alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is a never fixed mark that looks on every tempest and is ne'er shaken. Is a star to every wandering bark, every ship. Is worth unknown, although its height be taken. Love's not time's full, doesn't change with time. Though rosy lips and cheeks of youth, within its bending sickle's compass come, the old image of time, death, being something that mows down the grass, a sickle. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be false and upon me proved, I never read, nor no man ever loved. It's a very strong poem by Shakespeare, one of his great sonnets, saying, I'm telling you, my dear, that I'll never let anything get in the way of our love. I will love you always. So there are poems like that if you learn them, and on a romantic night, you say them to your beloved, maybe it'll change the whole situation. There's also poems that you can persuade somebody to something else. This is a famous poem by Andrew Marvell to his coy mistress. It was written in the early 1650s. And it's maybe more elegant language, but the kind of language young men might use with a young lady. Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness mistress would be no lady, would be no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk, and pass our long love's day. Now therefore, while the youthful you sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires in every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may. In other words, let's not waste time. Let's become lovers. I don't necessarily advocate that, but There's a lot of poetry along those lines. I can also tell you that you should study literature because it will make you happy. There's great comedies written in literature. There's very funny novels you can read. But it's also true that some literature, which is tragic, can make you sad, even though you can learn something from that as well. I can also tell you, as in my case, that you should read literature, learn literature, so you can become a diplomat. Now, this is another test question. Does anyone know who this famous diplomat was? Teachers can't answer. Does anyone? All right, I'll give you another hint. What did he study? This gentleman was born in Guangzhou into a family with a tradition of scholarship. And he went to the United States very early in 1919. That was the year of the May 4 Revolution. And he attended one of the great American liberal arts colleges, Amherst. And while he was there, the famous American poet Robert Frost got to see some of his poetry and commented on his great abilities. After graduation, he earned a master's degree at Cambridge University in Indo-European linguistics, and he returned to mainland China, and for 14 years he taught in English, professor of English, at universities in what was then called Peking and Shanghai. You know who he is now? All right. He played a big role in the early history of the Republic of China. In 1949, he became the first minister of foreign affairs. And while he was in that position, he signed the Sino-Japanese Peace Treaty in 1952. And this is a picture of him signing the treaty in what is today the Taipei Guest House. I think they still call it the Bingwa, though I know it has other meanings. Taipei Bingwa. And later, the Sino-American Mutual Peace Treaty, which remained in effect until 1979, when the United States broke relations with Taiwan. He was also ambassador to the United States from 1958 to 1961. But he got in trouble with Jiang Jiesu. He got in trouble because he voted on Mongolia's admission to the UN, which was basically because the United States asked him to do that because it was also part of a package deal. Mongolia could join the UN, and certain African countries could as well. But Chiang Kai-shek was very mad. As years later, when I was a note-taker in a meeting with Deng Xiaoping, referred to Wai Menggu, and he said, this is part of China, but that's history, we won't talk about it anymore. Let's talk about Taiwan, which is also part of China. Anyway, he was called back, and then he served as minister with our portfolio. Still don't know who he is? It was Ye Gongzhou. And when he retired from government, where did he teach? Tsinghua Daxue. And I tell you this story because I'm not nearly as accomplished as he is, but they gave me the George K.C. Chair professorship at Tsinghua because we both studied English, we both became diplomats, and I was the U.S. representative to Taiwan. So, in fact, I know a lot of diplomats, not only this one and me, but many others who actually studied literature in college. Many people, though, falsely assume that you have no future if you study literature. A famous case is Ted Turner. He founded CNN, also TBS. He became a famous philanthropist. He donated $1 billion to the United Nations. I'm not sure that's what I would have done, and he was the first to broadcast via satellites. But when he told his father he was going to Brown University, that he wanted to study classics, Latin and Greek literature, his father in a famous letter wrote to him and said, I am appalled, even horrified, that you have adopted classics as a major. As a matter of fact, I almost puked on the way home today. Jihu, Tula, his father was so angry at him. How could you do that? But you can get a job, you see, even if you study literature. In fact, many successful people in business, in politics, in entertainment, journalism, other fields began studying literature. And I'm going to give you some examples. On the upper left, Hank Paulson, former U.S. Treasury Secretary and also head of chairman of Goldman Sachs, one of the most important financial companies, investment companies in the world, studied literature. Sting, the famous English musician, he used to be with the Police. Maybe you don't recognize him, he's too old generation for you. But well-known singer. Harold Varmus, he got a Nobel laureate in medicine. He got both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in literature, also incidentally at Amherst College, and went on to get a Nobel Prize in medicine. This is Bob Woodward. He was the famous reporter that during the Nixon administration broke the story about Watergate, the big scandal that led to the resignation of a president. This is Anne Mulcahy, who is the former CEO and chairman of Xerox Corporation. At one point was the leading photocopy maker in the world. This is James Cameron, the famous director who did Titanic and Avatar and many other films. He also studied literature. Some more. I don't know if you know this guy, Van Diesel, the actor. This is Andrea Jung. She was the former Avon CEO, the largest door-to-door cosmetic sales in the world. This is Angelo Bartlett Giametti, former president of Yale University, and he was the 7th commissioner of Major League Baseball in the United States. This here is the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. This is 4-star General Eric Shinseki, who later became Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Also studied literature in college. And this is Steven Spielberg, E.T., and so many other films. Studied literature. All right, some more. Convince you. This is Sally Ride, who became a U.S. astronaut. This is Mario Cuomo, former governor of New York, whose son is currently the governor of New York as well. Recognize his face? I didn't vote for him, but this is Mitt Romney. He ran against Barack Obama a couple of years ago in order to become president of the United States. This is Martin Scorsese, who did so many famous films, including Goodfellas and many others. This here is Meryl Streep, the famous actress, who studied, I believe, at Yale Theater Arts, and before that, I think, at Vassar, studied literature. And this is A.G. Lafley, the former Procter & Gamble CEO. Okay? So actually, if you do research, you'll see a lot of people started out not by studying or not by reading in other subjects, but in literature. Another reason you might want to read literature, at least, if not study it, or at least take a class in it, is you're going to meet better-looking people. I would argue that if you look at these people, they are all famous actors and actresses, models. They all studied literature in college. Rosamund Pike, in one of the latest James Bond movies, she went to Oxford. James Franco is still working on a PhD at Yale. This is Brooke Shields, who went to Princeton. This is Paul Newman. He may be too old, he's dead now, but he's a famous American actor, Academy Award winner. He went to a small liberal arts college, Kenyon College in the United States. Matt Damon. You've probably seen in a lot of action flicks. Kate Beckinsale, She studied at Oxford or Cambridge, literature, and is in a lot of vampire movies now. Harrison Ford, you know, has been in lots of movies going back to Star Wars. And this is Famke Janssen, who's in many of the mutant movies. She's actually Dutch, but studied literature at Columbia University in New York. Now, some believe, in fact, literature prepares you best for success. A strong proponent of that is Michael Eisner. He was the CEO for Walt Disney Company, makes all those cartoon movies, for over 20 years, from 1984 to 2005. And he was quoted as saying, he didn't take a single business course when he was in university, not one. Instead, he studied English literature and theater and urged his 3 sons also to study English. Why? He defended his liberal arts education in an article published in USA Today, in which he said, literature is unbelievably helpful because no matter what business you are in, you are dealing with interpersonal relationships. It gives you an appreciation of what makes people tick. Now, understanding what makes people tick, the best word for that in English is empathy. I put the Chinese translation of that up there. And it's basically understanding, being sensitive to, and even experiencing, even though you're not that person, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, without actually having that experience yourself. And literature simulates that experience when you read literature. Is there evidence that reading literature enhances empathy? Actually, there is. There have been some scientific studies done. I'm going to cite 3 of them. One Canadian, one from New York, and one, I think, the Dutch. There is evidence. There's 2 Canadians, Raymond Marr, Keith Oatley. They did studies both in 2006 and 2009 that said that people who often read fiction appear to be better able to understand other people, to empathize with them and view the world from their perspective, to see the world as other people do. This link persisted even after they factored in the possibility that more empathetic people might choose to read more novels. And in the 2010 study, Marr also found a similar result for young children. The more stories they had read to them, the keener their understanding of other people's intentions. They could read people better. Why? Well, the speculation is that literary narratives, they offer models or simulations of the social world in which you interact. And it creates a deep experience of interactions that other people are having in the literature. And this helps communicate an understanding of social information, makes it more compelling, makes you a part of your learning experience. Another study that shows literature enhances empathy were 2 Dutch researchers in 2013. The 2 experiments they did showed that people who become emotionally involved in fiction become more empathetic. This was determined by having them read literature and then other people not reading literature and other people reading pulp fiction, ordinary, not great literature, and then testing the psychological test for empathetic feeling. More scientific evidence was published in Science magazine, a famous science magazine, in October 4 of last year at the New School for Social Research. They did a series of 5 experiments over 1,000 people, randomly assigned to read either literary fiction, popular fiction, or nothing. And then they were given tests for their empathetic feelings. The results, only literary fiction improve readers' capacity to understand what others are thinking and feeling. The reason appears to be the way literary fiction directly involves the reader. It requires intellectual engagement in what you're reading and creative thoughts. You can't just read it and not think about it, not feel it. So empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another. Now, this is crucial in navigating complex social relationships. This is why you can imagine it might be useful in diplomacy, in business, in anything you do in life. As Michael Eisner said, it gives you an appreciation of what makes other people tick. Reading high-level literary fiction not only increases your empathy, but also, I would argue, your emotional intelligence and your social perception. Why is all this relevant to you? Well, because your education is ideally about more than just acquiring knowledge and skills for a particular future job. Because no matter what you do, even if you have the expertise to become a good engineer, to be a scientist, to be a business person, you will not be as successful, as complete, or as fulfilled as you can be without personal development. Being the best that you can be in every way, developing all of your skills, all of your abilities. University education, I would argue along with high school education, is your best chance to begin exploring your options, what you're going to do with your life. And as Thomas Edison, the famous American inventor, the light bulb, the telephone, said, if we all did things we are capable of, we would astound ourselves. So it's trying to be the best self you can be. And I think reading literature, understanding literature, contributes to that overall goal. One of the lessons also is time, and I always tell this to all my students. Time is your most valuable natural resource. And just like all the most valuable resources in the world, it is not renewable. I mean, solar energy, but even solar cells. I recently went to a solar cell manufacturer. Over time, solar cells wear and they break down. You have to replace them. Time is your most precious resource. What does that mean? You shouldn't waste it. It's not renewable, and the older you get, the less of it you're going to have. So while you're young, you have to explore every option and consider every possibility for learning. So don't waste time. You're in the position of James Joyce wrote a novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And at the very end of the novel, he's packing up, he's going off to become a writer. And he writes that his mother is putting my new second-hand clothes, grows up in a poor family, in order. She prays now, she says that I may learn my own life and away from home and friends, what the heart is and what it feels. Amen, so be it. And he says, welcome, O life. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated consciousness of my race. I am going to create myself. Okay? And to do that, I have to go out and experience the world on my own. So, you're faced with choices now. I don't know if you recognize on the left, this is very popular in the United States, Halo. It's a war game. You shoot things all the time. You have a choice between video games like this, and I would suggest trying this instead in your spare time. Reading some literature. Time is running out. Now there's a famous American psychologist, Abraham Maslow, who talked about a hierarchy of needs. And he said that at the most fundamental level, we need to breathe, we need food, we need water, we need shelter, clothing, sleep. I think he said sex as well. These are basic drives we have. And then next level, we need safety and security. We have to worry about our health, a job, a about property, about family, social stability. But in the hierarchy of needs, the higher you rise, next step is friendship, family, intimacy, a sense of connection, confidence, achievement, respect of others, the need to be unique, and at the highest level, self-actualization, which involves things like creativity and morality and spontaneity and acceptance, experience, purpose, meaning, and inner potential. It's developing yourself to the highest level. Literature, I believe, also is, because of the empathy factor, everybody points out that in addition to your IQ, you have an emotional quotient, which, like an iceberg, is often the vast, unseen part of your character that influences how you're perceived by others. If you lack emotional quotient, a high EQ, you may well be the smartest person on earth, but you're not necessarily going to be that successful. You have to be able to interact well with other people, to understand them, to relate to them, to get along with them. Emotional intelligence, one of the definitions includes as characteristics empathy, the social skills, how do you manage your relationships, how do you build networks how do you find common ground and build rapport with other people, very important in business. Self-awareness, understand your own moods and emotions and drives, as well as how they affect other people, important lesson to learn. Self-regulation, to self-control. You know, sometimes to suspend judgment, to think before acting. And reading literature tells you what mistakes other people have made that you won't want to make. Internal motivation, the passion to work for internal reasons that go beyond money and status, external, such as an inner vision of what is important to you in life, a joy in doing something, curiosity in learning, being immersed in an activity, the flow that you get when that happens. Literature also strengthens your imagination. As famous Albert Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Imagining and envisioning what is possible, what you might invent, what you might do, what business you might start. J.K. Rowling, who I noted earlier, the Harry Potter novelist, she says, unlike any other creature on this planet, humans can learn and understand without having experience. They can think themselves into other people's places. Imagination is not only the uniquely human capacity to envision that which is not, and therefore the fount of all invention and innovation. In its arguably most transformative and revelatory capacity is the power that enables us to empathize with humans whose experience we have never shared. Some examples of that in literature. Romeo and Juliet, it's not William Shakespeare, it was written probably in 1595, the late 16th century. It describes teenagers in the Renaissance of Verona, Italy, who commit suicide rather than be separated from one another. And in many ways, if you read correctly, Shakespeare is critical of that kind of passionate love which would lead to the death of two people, the foolishness of it. But you can, without going through that experience, you can read it. And if you're ever in love, and you're thinking bad thoughts, you might read that play again. Moby Dick. It's an epic voyage, great American novel about the pursuit of a ferocious, enigmatic great white whale, a huge whale, which on an earlier voyage destroys the ship of Captain Ahab and bites off the lower part of his leg. But mixed in with the descriptions of whale hunting, you're probably never going to hunt whales, it's now illegal. You also get an exploration of social class, social status on a ship, which is very, very regulated, the difference all the way from the captain to the lowest level, good and evil, and even the question of the existence of God. You can read a portrait of a lady, a young, free-spirited, inexperienced American woman suddenly inherits a lot of money. And she goes to Europe, seeks her future there, and she falls victim to two scheming American expatriates who are living there, one of whom she stupidly marries. She nonetheless remains stubbornly committed to living with the consequences of her choices. It's very much a psychological novel. I read it when I was early on in college. And for the first time, I thought it helped me understand the thinking, the calculations of a woman trying to decide whom to marry. But also the mistakes that you can make. And it's a brilliantly written novel, written in 1881. Secret Agent. It's a thriller. Joseph Conrad is interesting because he was Polish, emigrated to England, and yet he's considered one of the greatest writers in the English language. Taught himself. So the hope that all of us can one day be proficient in another language. And it's about a double agent who gets into a group of anarchists who want to blow up London. And as one critic pointed out after 9/11, his insight into the way terrorism works is a fine example of how a novelist can detect the future long before a social scientist does. He was writing about terrorism back in 1907. Another example, Grapes of Wrath, 1939. It's about a poor family during the Dust Bowl days in Oklahoma when there was a drought, and poor tenant farmers who worked on other people's land were starving to death. They had no food, they were making no money, and they were forced out of work and to seek a future elsewhere. And there's a great migration, and this is the story of one family, a migration from the Midwest of America to California, and what they hope will be a better life, and the tragedies they encounter along the way. Lord of the Flies, a book I read when I was in high school. It's about a group of British boys who are stranded on an island, just the boys. And they try to set up a society of their own, a government. And instead, they descend into savagery. Very compelling novel. Literature, actually, also is important because it addresses all the big issues in life. And these are just some of the many. You know, ambition. Think of something like Macbeth, wanting to become king. Beauty, birth, betrayal, courage. Red Badge of Courage, an American novel. Crime, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. Death, deception, despair, duty, family, failure, fear, fortune, freedom, friendship, God, good versus evil, growing up, growing old, guilt, happiness, hatred, heroism, innocence, jealousy, loneliness, loss, love, loyalty, man's struggle against nature. Read Jack London's novels. Man's struggle against society, marriage, meaninglessness, perseverance, prejudice, revenge, sacrifice, suffering, truth, tyranny, and war. There's nothing else you can study, nothing else you can read that is going to address all these big issues in the same way. Galileo, the great scientist, said, "This grand book, the universe, is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures." True enough. But it's also true, I think, that the grand book of our humanity is recorded in literature. From the earliest literature on, you will see the same common human themes across the world. More than any other area of learning, literature is about you. It speaks to you directly, addresses your own feelings, your experiences, your hopes, your fears, your desires, your dreams. Because almost anything you can experience, somebody has experienced something similar to that at some time. In that process, you also see the commonality of all human experience. And in fact, you learn that you're not alone. an important lesson also if you're going to be a diplomat. You're not alone in the world, that there is something that binds all of us together. C.S. Lewis said, "In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself." Literature strengthens your sense of shared humanity because you can imagine yourself in someone else's body, mind, clothes, and culture. Very important, actually, if you're going to be a diplomat, to understand and appreciate other cultures. And you'll see things like I have. I've never been to any society where parents don't want their children to be happy, unless they're psychotic, to have a better life than they did. I've never been in any country where people don't want to enjoy a meal with friends, maybe, except in Islamic cultures, a glass of wine with it, or a beer. I've never been in any culture where people don't appreciate a welcoming smile. There's an awful lot of commonality in human nature. So because literature enhances your EQ, besides enhancing your EQ, literature actually increases your IQ. First of all, it expands your vocabulary, an important skill. It improves the precision of your writing and speaking. It's a great asset if you're going to be a businessman, or if you're going to be a diplomat, or you're going to do any public speaking. But more than that, it enhances the organization of your ideas. Why? It expands your power of thought because language is the essential tool of all thinking outside of mathematics, which is its own internal world. Try to think of any complex idea and not use words to think of it. I can say rose and you can just imagine the image of a rose. But if I tell you to think about how we'd avoid unification with China, or how do you achieve unification with China, you can't begin thinking about it unless you use words. You have to work out your ideas in language. Without words, no ideas. So that's why in George Orwell, in his famous novel 1984, about a totalitarian society of the future, in that society the government creates something called newspeak. And what they do is they begin to gradually eliminate the number of words. So that finally, there are words like beautiful and marvelous and wonderful and, and precious and terrific. There's only good and ungood. And you begin to limit everybody's words. And the reason you do that is because when people lose words and the complexity and nuance that words offer, the multiple meanings, it says here, don't you see the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible. You won't be able to think anything other than the government wants because there will be no words in which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed in exactly one word, and with its meaning rigidly defined, and all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten. Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. And the result is, at the end of the book, throughout the book, the ministry of truth, which is the ministry of lies, tells everybody that war is peace. So there's no peace, there's only war. Freedom is slavery, so there's only slavery. And ignorance is strength, so there's only ignorance. People should think. This is a picture of George Orwell, one of my favorite modern authors. Literature, this will be sort of the last section, I'll give you some examples, can also serve as a guide to life. Maybe as a negative guide sometimes, that this is not what I want to do. And I found over the course of my life, there are 5 areas that literature was useful for me. One was in growing up, coming of age. One was in social and political awareness. One was being in love. One was death. And one was coming to terms with your life, my own life, what life means to me. As an example, when I was in high school, the most popular book at the time was a novel called The Catcher in the Rye. And almost all of us as youths read it. And I remember this passage, which meant a lot. It said, "You'll find that you're not the first person who is ever confused and frightened and even sickened by human behavior. You're by no means alone on that score. You'll be excited and stimulated to know many, many men have been just as troubled morally and spiritually as you are right now. Happily, some of them kept records of their troubles and wrote them down. You'll learn from them if you want to. Just as someday, if you have something to offer, someone will learn something from you. It's a beautiful reciprocal arrangement, and it is an education. What he means is it's through education, it's history, it's poetry, it's literature. It's what you read that you can experience these things." Then, when I was early on in college, I read Paradise Lost. A lot of it I didn't like. It's very religious. It's about trying to justify the ways of God to man. It was written in 1667. But the ending of it always moved me. Adam and Eve, if you know the story of the Garden of Eden, Eve tempts Adam to eat the forbidden apple on the tree, the forbidden fruit. He does, and as a result, God punishes them for their disobedience. And he kicks them out of heaven, out of Eden. And I was always moved by the ending where, in either hand, the hastening angel, the angel is kicking them out, caught our lingering parents, they're lingering, they're reluctant to go. Into the eastern gate led them direct, and down the cliff as fast to the subjected plain, then disappeared. They, looking back at all the eastern side, beheld of paradise, so late their happy seat, their happy place, waved over by that flaming throb, flaming brand, the gate with dreadful faces of the angels who thronged, and firing arms. And then a shift. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest and providence their guide. They hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. And indeed, that's the condition of every young person going into life. Hand in hand, solitary, you go your way. You have to make up life on your own. I also became more socially and politically aware. I read George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London. It's a non-fiction work, but he talks about pretending to be poor, becoming poor, so he could experience the lives of those who are down and out, who have nothing. And the lessons he learned, including you make discoveries which outweigh some of the others. You discover boredom and mean complication and the beginnings of hunger. But you also discover the great redeeming feature of poverty, the fact that it annihilates the future. Because all you worry about is now. What am I going to eat? Where am I going to sleep? Anyway, I won't read it on because I'm going a little bit too slow. One of the works I read in high school that influenced me a great deal was by the African-American author, The Fire Next Time. And reading, growing up, where every day I pledged allegiance to the American flag, reading a writer who said, the American Negro has the great advantage of having never believed the collection of myths to which white Americans cling, that their ancestors were all freedom-loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country the world has ever seen, and that Americans are invincible in battle and wise in peace, that Americans have always dealt honorably with Mexicans and Indians and all other neighbors or inferiors, and that American men are the world's most direct and virile, that American women are pure. So it was a new perspective that literature opened up to me when I was a sophomore in the second year of high school. From Catch-22, a great novel about World War II, a satirical novel, one of the funniest novels I've ever read. Catch-22 is the fact that Catch-22 was that if you're crazy, the military won't keep you in this case, in the Air Force anymore, you can leave and go home because you're crazy. On the other hand, if you go to the government, you go to the Air Force headquarters, and you say, I'm crazy, I need to leave, they'll say, well, the very fact you're crazy and you want to go proves you're rational, so you're not crazy. Catch-22. So you're stuck where you are. It's hopeless for you. And he meditates on life in general. He wondered how many people were destitute that same night, even in his own prosperous country. How many homes were shanties, how many husbands were drunk and wives socked. How many children were bullied, abused, or abandoned. How many families hungered for food they could not afford to buy. How many hearts were broken, how many suicides would take place. How many people would go insane. How many cockroaches and landlords would triumph. How many winners will lose as successes, failures, and rich men, poor men. How many wise guys were stupid. How many happy endings were unhappy endings. And so forth. So, and then love, reading literature. If you've ever had, as a young person, a love affair go awry, go badly, you know, I found solace in this very early romantic poem by William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet. Down by the Sally Gardens, my love and I did meet. She passed the Sally Gardens. Sally is where you go walking with your partner. Down by the Sally Gardens, my love and I did meet. She passed the Sally Gardens with little snow-white feet. She bid me take love easy, as the leaves grow on the tree, on the tree. But I, being young and foolish, with her would not agree. In a field by the river, my love and I did stand, and on my leaning shoulder she laid her snow-white hand. She bid me take life easy, as the leaves grow on the weir, the embankments by the water. But alas, I was young and foolish, and now am full of tears. So particularly when you're young, sometimes it's best not to take love too seriously, like Romeo and Juliet. Now we have 1 year old, and I've got Colin Farrell reciting this. William Butler, the actor, Colin Farrell, if you could start it up. William Butler Yeats loved a woman named Maud Gonne his whole life. But she loved politics.
And gray, and full of sleep, and nodding by the fire. Take down. On this book, and slowly read, and dream of the soft look your eyes had once, and of your shadows deep. How many loved your moments of glad grace, and loved your beauty with love false or true, but one man loved the pilgrim soul in you, and loved the sorrows of your changing face. And bending down beside the glowing bars, murmured a little sadly how love fled, and paced upon the mountains overhead, and hid his face amid a crowd of stars.
Well, William Butler Yeats' love for this woman was unrequited his whole life. And so here in this poem, he imagines, it's sort of a poem that maybe one day when you are old, he said to Maud, you're old and gray, and you're nodding, falling asleep by the fire, you'll remember the man who loved you true. So in a way, it's a wish fulfillment poem. Maybe at that point in your life, you'll recognize how I was really, truly your best love. And there are other poems, one I particularly like, but I won't go all through it, that, you know, someone imagines that time of year thou mayest me behold when yellow leaves are none or few, but worth the falls. Do hang upon those boughs, the trees, where late the sweet birds, which shake against the cold, bare room choirs where late the sweet birds sang. So you grow old, you know, lovers grow old. And she recognizes that perhaps, the lover does. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well. which thou must leave ere long, because love won't last because you won't last. One of the harsh realities of life. Now I'd like to do something on death. I remember when my mother died, I was in college, and realizing that the whole world had just kind of stopped for me. And I think this poem by W.H. Auden captures it well. I'm going to show you, rather than go through the poem myself, there's a scene in the British film, 4 Weddings and a Funeral, where I think it nicely conveys the love of one man for another and the sense of loss when that person goes. You'll see parts of the movie, and the text will screen up.
Perhaps you will forgive me if I turn from my own feelings to the words of another splendid bugger, W.H. Auden. This is actually what I want to say. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. Silence the pianos and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin. Let the mourners come. Let the aeroplanes circle moaning overhead, scribbling in the sky the message, he is dead. Put crepe bows round the white necks of the public doves. Let traffic policemen wear black cotton gloves. He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. The stars are not wanted now. Put out everyone. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood. For nothing now can ever come to any good.
So I think that poem very nicely captures the sense of finality when death comes, and the sense of loss that those who love that person feel when that person is gone. Now finally, coming to terms with what life means, there are various poets who have tried to figure that out. They have different answers. Some will appeal to you and some won't. One that's beautifully expressed, but I don't particularly agree with, is from Ode, Imitations of Mortality. Wordsworth was kind of a pantheist. He believed God was everywhere. He said, "What though the radiance was once so bright, be now forever taken from my sight? Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, again growing old. We will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind, in the primal sympathy which having been must ever be, in the soothing thoughts that spring out of human suffering, in the faith that looks through death, in years that bring the philosophic mind." A less optimistic view, I won't go through the whole thing, but Matthew Arnold in Dover Beach expresses a view not that you're going to find some reconciliation, but all you can ever hope for is the love of one other person. And at the end, he goes and describes how the sea of faith, religion, which was once, surrounded the world, but now that has all changed. And says, "Our love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams. So various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." It's a much tougher attitude toward what it all means. And then Finally, one thing that I think it's a great short story. It comes from, it's the last short story in a book by James Joyce, the Irish writer, called The Dead. It's in a collection of stories called The Dubliners, written in 1914, or The Dead was written earlier. And these are the final lines from him. What the situation is, there's been a party going on all along for a long night. And his wife is not feeling well and retires to the bedroom. And he's been imagining all night that she really loves him and how truly she loves him. And when he arrives in the room and she's looking out the window, he asks, "What is it? What is it you see?" And he thinks that she's thinking of him. And she tells him, in fact, she's thinking of a young man by the name of Michael Fury, who loved her. And that one night, from the same window, she looked out of him as he shivered in the snow, looking up at her. And he died. And he told her, he thought of how she lay beside him. Now this is the husband. His wife is beside him. And locked in her heart for so many years, that image of her lover's eyes, Michael Fury, when he had told her that he did not wish to live. He didn't want to live if he couldn't be with her. Generous tears filled Gabriel's eyes, the husband. He never felt like that himself towards any woman. But he knew that such a feeling must be love. So he realizes now that even what he felt wasn't even love. The tears gathered more thickly in his eyes, and in the partial darkness he imagined he saw the form of a young man standing under a dripping tree. Other forms were near. His soul had approached that region where dwell the vast hosts of the dead, people of the past. He was conscious of, but could not apprehend, their wayward and flickering existence. His own identity was fading out into the gray, impalpable world, the solid world itself, which these dead at one time reared and lived in, was dissolving and dwindling. A few light taps upon the window pane made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily the snowflakes, silver and dark, falling obliquely against the lamplight. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. He's a businessman. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, on the bog of Allen, and further westward, softly falling into the dark and mutinous Shannon waves, the Sea of Shannon. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. It's one of the great moments of, I think, recognition in English literature, of realizing that his whole life, in a sense, has been a lie. I think this is the last one. Gerard Manley Hopkins was a priest who, when he became a priest, he gave up all the poetry, he burned it, that he had written early in his life. But this poem encapsulates, I think, some of the sadness of life, which is that all that's beautiful passes away. The transience of existence, which a lot of literature is about. And he continued to secretly write poems while he was a priest. And this one is a poem to a young child named Margaret. And she's looking at the yellow leaves falling off down from the tree, and she begins to weep, to cry. And he says, "Margaret, are you grieving over golden groves on leaving? Leaves like the things of man you with your fresh thoughts care for. Can you? Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder, by and by, nor spare a sigh, though whirls of one would leaf me lie. And yet you will weep and know why. Now, no matter, child, the name, sorrow's springs are the same. Nor mouth had, nor mind expressed, what heart heard of, ghost guessed. It is the blight, the sickness, man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for." So, my final summary, reading books makes you better. You can't buy happiness, but you can buy books, and that's sort of the same thing, kind of the same thing. The man who does not read good books, and the woman who does not read good books has no advantage over the man who can't read them, who's illiterate. That's Mark Twain, the famous American writer. Literature allows you to see beyond the walls of yourself. Literature will make you a smarter, more attractive, and generally more interesting young adult. Thank you very much.
非常谢谢司徒主任给我们这个精彩演讲，主要是讲那个文学哈。那我想在座各位有很多同学是物理系的，还有其他科学系的同学，那是不是有任何问题可以提出来？Any question?
对不起，我知道上面不知道。Doesn't have to be on literature, it can be about anything.
About
任何的问题。
也可以问文化问题啊。有没有任何问题？提出来。
Don't be shy.
就是全球化，现在全球化就是每一个国家都有贫富差距。那这个你对这个有什么看法？而且你对这个有什么想法可以去解决？
Well, I think it's a terrible problem. Actually, I've given lectures on, at least partly on that subject. Actually, the worst country or the worst place in the world now for the difference between the rich and the poor is Hong Kong. And one of the worst after that, ranking about 7th place, is mainland China. The United States is somewhere in the 20th worst. Because there's something called the Gini index, which measures the gap between the richest and the poorest. And surprisingly, Taiwan isn't that bad. The last time I checked, it was out of some 120 or 40 countries, it was ranked about in the middle. So there are many countries that are worse, but the tendency in lots of countries now, including Taiwan, is for the gap to continue to widen. I think it's a terrible problem. For one thing, if you look at, there's something called happiness economics. And what it tries to do is determine where are people happiest. And the countries that are at the top of those lists are in general countries that are democracies, where the gap between the richest and poorest is small. Generally where there are many social benefits. They also tend to be small and rich countries, like Norway and Sweden, with small populations, with not much diversity. In other words, they don't necessarily provide a model for other countries. For example, the U.S. won't score as high in many categories because, you know, we have so many immigrants who come into the United States from so many different cultures, and it takes a while before many of them can rise up the ladder, and some never do. But there are still terrible pockets of poverty in the United States. But clearly this is an issue that increasingly all governments are going to have to address. It's a very serious problem everywhere. The Chinese government on the mainland is going to have to address it. Taiwan needs to address it because of the stagnation in wages for young people. Your wages aren't going up. The United States needs to address it. There are increasingly studies out that the greatest proportion of wealth in the United States belongs to the top 1%. It's not even the top 10 or 20%. So it's a fact that, and there's a columnist for the New York Times, Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who you can find online, who writes about this problem a lot. There's a new book out by a French scholar, which has been described a lot, in which he talks about this wealth gap. So people are beginning to look at it, but almost all the solutions involve politics, and that's very difficult. In general, particularly because even in the United States, there are other studies showing that it's the wealthiest who have the most effect on how our legislature decides things. And this is a problem. Almost any democracy, people will put their money where their own interests are, rather than looking out for the interests of everyone. It's a real problem.
Any questions? What kind of literature would you recommend for beginners to start with? For example, novels or classic or dramas? What kind of literature work would you recommend for beginners?
Well, I think whatever you find easiest to read and most enjoyable. For example, Jane Austen has written some terrific novels, but in general, young men are not going to find them as interesting as young women. Whereas you might enjoy more the stories of Jack London, or Mark Twain, or things that interest you more, on subjects that interest you more. Read about Ernest Hemingway, who has great stories about fishing, about hunting, who has great stories about bullfighting. So I think what you should do is find, to start with, literature that interests you. You can look on lists of great literature. There are many on the internet that describe the basic outlines of plot or stories, and find something that you enjoy. The advantage of reading plays is you can read a whole play. If your English is pretty good, just a matter of a few hours. Unless it's Shakespeare, which takes longer, and it's more slow going, even for many Americans. Poetry, you have to be in the right mood for poetry. You have to be susceptible to the feeling of the poem when you read it. But you can pick up and read a poem at any point. Sometimes you can start off with a more humorous poem. There's a lot of funny poems out there. There's one novel that almost everyone enjoys if you can get into it is Catch-22. But again, I wouldn't be too prescriptive. I think the important thing is to read literature. Next time you're going to play a video game, there's many novels and stories and poems now for free. You can just get online and read them. You don't have to buy them. And you can get guidance online, what to read. And people have blogged about that, of what's, at your age, what your interests are. What should you be looking for? I think all literature has great value if it's really literature. It's not, it's not just pulp fiction. And even there, an author like John Le Carre, who writes thrillers, he writes at a much higher level than say, somebody you haven't heard of. But there are other people who don't write in finer style with this deep and imagining of people's thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, that question? I won't.
When you're studying literature during college or graduate school, what kind of me, when you're studying literature in college and graduate school, what kind of obstacles that you have and how did you overcome?
What kind of obstacles?
For example, we all start with genre literature. My experience, because personally I'm planning for literature as well. So I would like to know if there's any difficulties that when we are studying literature and how to overcome these obstacles.
Well, I mean, there are some of the difficulties you would face in any program. There are things you're going to like less. The graduate school where I went to, I had to study Old English and read Beowulf in the original, and I didn't particularly enjoy it because you have to, it's like learning a whole new language. But it was required. So you'll find certain things you have to do which you're not so interested in. Sometimes it's just the sheer volume. I was taking 4 courses in a semester, and one of them was on Victorian novels of the 1850s. And I had to read 15 novels, the shortest of which was 450 pages, which meant every night, you know, I had to read like 200 pages of a novel in order to read them all. And then, of course, I had to write long papers about them. So there are those kinds of things. I think the biggest question is, you know, once you finish, I was always plagued by the idea, what was I going to do? At that point, I wanted to be a writer, but when I was offered a fellowship for graduate school, I thought, well, I'll be a professor. And then later, I changed my mind, as I indicated earlier. You do need to have, you know, it sounds like your English is already quite good, it's excellent. So, you know, what you might want to do early on when you're in graduate school is start looking around for opportunities. If you're going to be a professor, a teacher, where you can go. And start thinking about publishing. Because it's, you know, the academic world, as I'm sure you know, depends on publishing and getting something published that you've written. And so you have to think in practical terms about that. If you do a good term paper or write a good paper and the professor commends it, you might ask for advice about how do I turn it into something that I can get published.
Well, so I want to ask you what's your point about Taiwan and China? And should we develop with China have a closer relationship in the economy and such other things?
Well, you may have seen the interview I did yesterday in Ziyou Shibao. The longer version of my views was in the Taipei Times, which very few people read, but the interview was actually in English. It was 2 hours, and in the Taipei Times there's a fuller explanation. And this morning I was attacked for not understanding Taiwan by the Minister of Economics, and also by, in a way, criticized by AIT. But what I said was that it was my strong view that the U.S., in its own trading relationship with Taiwan, should not allow the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this bigger agreement. That's one issue. But the U.S. can develop a better, stronger trading relationship with Taiwan, irrespective of what agreements are reached with China. And I thought the U.S. should do more to to develop its own trading relationship with Taiwan. Now, I've often said, even when I was at AIT, and many other people have said, my concern was that Taiwan was putting all of its eggs in one basket. It was becoming too dependent on trade with China. And this has increasingly been the case. And I think that's why people, young people in particular, have been worried about the latest service trade agreement. So I do think it's important that Taiwan, even while it trades with China, it can't avoid that. It's too close. There's too much investment already in China. While it develops its relationship with China, it's very important at the same time that Taiwan be tried to develop relations, economic and trade relations with other countries who are willing to do so. Now, it's quite possible that there are some countries that are afraid to trade with Taiwan or to sign agreements with Taiwan unless China agrees to it, or unless the service trade agreement is signed between Taiwan and China. But the United States is not one of them. The United States is not going to be bullied by China, I don't think. So I would suggest that that Taiwan reach out, even as it continues to work on its relationship with China, and to the maximum extent possible, to the extent it can, it should try to develop trading relations with others, to expand those relations. Naturally, trade's a two-way street.
I really enjoy your talk today. Thank you very much. And I know one thing. I know why you are so successful in your career. Yeah, today. Because you have very solid background in English literature, so you understand it. Okay. And I think from writer to diplomat, so you have very wonderful career path. I think, I believe you have a lot of experience just for how to communicate with others and with different people. And I think sometimes you may be very, a lot of trouble in handling some special issues like recently, right? Okay, so my question is, can you just share your experience with us? Like something like a very, very hard problem you ever faced. Just give one example you have to share with.
The whole experience when I was in China in 1989, 1990, after Tiananmen Square was a very difficult period, because the ambassador at that time assigned me to be the officer in charge of dealing with the two people who fled and hid in our embassy, the astrophysicist Fan Lijie and his wife Li Suxian. And I had to go and meet with them 3 nights a week, and then one Saturday or Sunday afternoon every week. So 4 times a week for a year, while they were hiding in an office building within the U.S. embassy. And I found that a great strain, because there was always the question. I was in most of the negotiations about their release, many meetings, and I was always worried whether in fact they would get out or not. And toward the end also, I think, I was followed a lot, as was my wife at the time, who was also a diplomat, by Chinese security authorities. in a car wherever we went, because I guess they knew that I had something to do with family jury. I found that a very difficult experience in my time, just psychologically. And I know it was a great relief when finally, about 13 months after he came into the embassy, we got a negotiated agreement for him to leave, he and his wife. And they flew in a U.S. Air Force jet, and I was able to get on the jet with them. And I flew with them to Alaska, where we refueled, and then we flew on to England, where they stayed overnight at a U.S. Air Force base. And then the next day, the British Foreign Office took over. And then I got on the plane that night and flew to Bangkok and then back to Beijing. So I went around the world in 3 days. But it was a great relief to know that it finally gotten out. But the whole year after Tiananmen, not only the family juror case, but the whole mood in China had changed so much, and things were so difficult for those of us in the U.S. Embassy. At one point, there were police with automatic weapons stationed every 3 feet around our embassy. And it was a difficult experience. There are many other examples I could cite, but that's one of them.
没有任何问题了哈。那我们非常感谢司徒主任给我们这个精彩讲，尤其是让我们知道这个文学的一个重要性。那我们可以从文学里面学习到怎么样去与人相处等等啊。也觉得我们学了很多他在 AIT 的一些经验，非常感谢。好，接下来。